We mentioned earlier in the week what the Mefarshim grapple with, and that is the need for a second bris, the bris of Hagrizim and Har Evel, when we already had the bris, of course, of Matan Torah, of Har Sinai. And we suggested that perhaps the bris of Hagrizim and Har Evel are on those things which are not publicly discernible, like all the arurin in Parshas Ki Savo, are things which the Mefarshim explain are nichlal in arur, because people can't see them necessarily on the outside. They're chatam, which are done on the inside. And therefore, the Torah has the toichach of Parshas Ki Savo b'lashon yachid as opposed to lashon Rabbi. And we pointed out that it could very well be, as the Ramban tells us, that the toichach of Parshas Ki Savo is keneged the Churban Bayis Sheni. And the Churban Bayis Sheni, in fact, it was noted by Chazal, one of their greatest downfalls was the fact that they presented themselves one way and weren't able to recognize their shortcomings. That's what Chazal tell us. When it came to Churban Bayis Rishon, Nisgalu Avonoisam, their chatam were out in the open. They weren't hiding anything. And therefore, Nisgalu Kitzam. When you don't hide things, so then you're able to do tshuva. When a person is convincing himself that his chatam don't exist, he's not able to do tshuva. So therefore the Gemara says, Nisgalu Avonoisam, since their Avonos, their chatam were revealed, they were recognizing the fact that they had shortcomings, the Rebbeinu Shalom was confident that they would ultimately do tshuva, and therefore, Nisgalu Kitzam, the Rebbeinu Shalom says, this galus will only last for 70 years. It was given a kates mitchila. However, the second Churban Bayis, where loy nizgalu avonim, their chataim, like the chatam described in Parshas Ki Savo, in the toichach of Parshas Ki Savo, were loy nizgalu avonim, chatam that were done beseiser, as the psukim describe, chatam which aren't clearly recognizable on the outside, but one knows on the inside of his heart of hearts, he knows that he's lacking, and therefore those chataim, a person is not willing to look himself in the mirror and acknowledge those chatam. The Rebbeinu Shalom says, how could I ever be confident that you're going to do tshuva? You haven't really acknowledged the fact that there are any shortcomings over here. The first step to doing tshuva is hakaras hachet, to realize that you are being chayte. If you haven't convinced yourself that you're being chayte, but you still think that you're a tzaddik yesod olam, there's no chance for tshuva. And therefore, by the Churban Bayis Sheni, where it was loynis galu avoinam, the Rebbeinu Shalom says, loynis galu kitzim. How could I ever guarantee exactly when that date is going to be? If it's loynis galu avoinam, there's no guarantee when you will be doing tshuva. And therefore, the second Churban Bayis is described in the parashiyos of Ki Savo, which are describing those chataim of loynis galu avoinam, the chataim that were done b'seiser. But the truth is that we know that beyond this description of Chazal, when it comes to Churban Bayis Sheni, we know, perhaps more famous than Loy Nizgalu Avoinam, the Gemara in Maseches Yuma, Chazal also tell us that there was another trademark for the Churban Bayis Sheni, and that was, of course, the Isser, the terrible Chomer, the Averas of Sinas Chinam. In fact, if you put both of these things together, the Chazal that says that Churban Bayis Sheni came about because of Sinas Chinam, together with the Chazal that tells us that Churban Bayis Sheni was loy nizgalu avoinam, the picture that is painted is the one which is described by the Mefarshim, by the Nitziv, that we have the wrong concept of what it means, sinas chinam. We think sinas chinam, that you have people ignoring each other, not having anything to do with each other, hating each other, terrible, terrible hatred. But the Nitziv describes, if you take a look at the Gemara says, by Bayis Sheni, there was Torah, there was Gemilas Chasadim, there was Yira, there was Mitzvahs, there's everything going on. That means they were Oisek B'Gemilas Chasadim, the Gemara says. So on the one hand, the Gemara says there was Sinas Chinam. On the other hand, there are Oisek B'Gemilas Chasadim. In fact, what do we see? That what our concept of Sinas Chinam doesn't mean that there was no Gemachs, doesn't mean that there was no Gemilas Chasadim. On the contrary, they had convinced themselves that they were so successful in their Avodas Hashem. Certainly that included, of course, learning and davening, and of course, Gemilas Chasadim. But it was that inner hatred that they had, the inner animosity that they had, that animosity that wasn't revealed on the outset, on the surface of each person, but that was inside very often the shortcomings in sinas chinam, as it was in the case of Bayesheni, are in fact shortcomings which are beseiser. So therefore this Beis Hamikdash Bayesheni was destroyed because of primarily sinas chinam, but sinas chinam which is lo nizgalu avonav, where the people didn't even recognize that they were doing sins. The Nitziv describes how people were hating each other in the name of the Rebbeinu Shalom for religious reasons. They were accusing people of being accusing people of being tzedukim. All because they thought that this is what the Rebbeinu Shalom wants. So if they're not even willing to recognize their chait of sinas chinam, the Rebbeinu Shalom says, Lo nizgalu avoinam, lo nizgalu kitzam. But this understanding that Churban Bayesheni, which is described according to the Ramban in Parshas Ki Savo, comes about because of a breakdown in Avas Chinam, a breakdown in Bein Adam Lechaveru, I think gives us a bit of an insight into a nuance in the parsha which needs some understanding. We know that the Torah introduces this parsha of Ki Savo, the klalos and the brachos of Parshas Ki Savo, with Bikurim, which we discussed last night, comes for a very crucial, important reason, comes on the heels of the mitzvah of Zechiras Maisa Amalek. And then after Mikra Bikurim, so the Torah describes what we call Vidui Meiser. Person brings all his Meiser and he proclaims to the Rebbeinu Shalom that he has in fact done everything his responsibility. Ki sechala la'aser es kol maser tvuoscha b'ashona hashlishis shnas ha'maiser v'nasata l'levi lager le'yosim v'la'almona ve'ochel b'sharecha v'saveyu. You brought your meiser sheni. All the meisers have been taken care of, and you've done all your responsibilities. You've accomplished when it comes to your meisers. V'amarta lifnei Hashem elokecha bi'arti ha'kodesh min habayis. Nothing remains. You got rid of everything. V'gam nesat Levi v'lager le'yosim v'la'almona kechol mitzvoscha shirtzi v'sani lo avarti mi mitzvaysecha v'lo yishachachti. I haven't been over anything. I was mevarech. I gave the bracha. Everything I did. Lo achalti be'oini. I didn't eat it as an oini mimenu v'lo bi'arti mimenu b'tama. It wasn't mitama v'lo nesati mimenu l'meis. Everything you asked from me, Rebbeinu Shalom, I was mekayim when it comes to the halachas of meiser. V'shamati b'kol Hashem Elokai asisi kechol asher tzivisani. And then the Torah says, Hashkifa mima'oin kodshecha. Since I did everything that you asked me, Rabbi Shalom, says Rashi, once I've already said clearly that I've done everything that you've asked me to do, Hashkifa mimoin kodshecha min hashamayim. Now it's your turn to look down from heaven and do what you said you were going to do. Uvareich es amcha es Yisrael v'esu adama asher nasata lanu, and give a bracha to Klal Yisrael. So of course we have to understand why are the brachas and klalas, which are about to be enumerated, the bris of Hagrizim and Har Evel, why is that preempted by specifically the mitzvah of Meiser, but more specifically the mitzvah of Vidui Meiser? But even more than that, we have an interesting language. Hashkifa mim'oin kodshecha min hashamayim. Look down, the Rebbeinu Shalom, look down from Shamayim and bless Klal Yisrael. Chazal say that language, Hashkifa, is a very strange language, and in fact Chazal tell us that any time that language is usually used lira'ah. Usually it's forecasting something negative. Hashkifa is not a very positive word. It's ominous. It's something which tells us something bad is about to come. And in fact, we know when it comes to the malachim in Stoim, vayashkifu al pnei Sidoim, and Chazal tell us, Vayashkifu uses that language of Hashkafa, and there are many languages the Torah could use to say gaze. Vayabitu, Vayiru. Hashkifu is always Lashon Ra, Chazal say. There's only one exception. There's only one time in the Torah where the language of Hashkifa is used and it's positive, and say Chazal, that is our parsha and Parshas Ki Savo. And when it comes to Vidui Meiser, where the person says, I've done everything I'm supposed to, Hashkifa mim'oin kodshecha min hashamayim. Kol hashkafa shebimikra lira'ah chutz me'hashkifa mim'oin kodshecha. Why? Chazal tell us, Gadol koyach matanis aniyim shahoifech midas roiges l'rachamim. To tell us that matnas aniyim, Meiser, which is the parsha, is so great that it could change the Rebbeinu Shalom's Hanhaga of Roiges, Hanhaga of Midas Hadin, and change it to Rachamim. So even a word which is normally associated with Ra'ah, the word of Hashkifa, through Matnais Aniyim, could be changed and transformed to something which is Toiv, something which is good. What are Chazal getting at over here? Specifically, Matnas Aniyim. What's this language of Hashkifa that specifically Matnas Aniyim could change from the language of, from the Hanhaga of Roges, Midas Hadir, to the Hanhaga of Rachamim, Midas HaRachamim, and that has to be the message which brings Klal Yisrael into the Brachos and Klalos, the new bris of Hagrizim and Har-Evel. I think perhaps we could understand, if we take a step back, and take a look at that other Hashkafa, Hashkifa that Chazal point to. The Hashkifa, Vayashkifu al Pnei Sidoim, the Malachim look at Sidoim. And when they look at Sidoim, they see something very, very bad. They don't just see a nation, a society which has deteriorated and which is corrupt. But as we've discussed in the past, they see something much worse than that. We know that the Mishnah in Avos tells us that there are Dalid Arba Midos Ba'adam. There's a person who says, Ha'omer Shali Shali, what's mine is mine. V'shalach Shalach, and what's yours is yours. Zu Midah Beinonis. We consider there's a Midah Beinonis, not a terrible Rasha. You're not taking anything of anyone else. You're not taking advantage. And you're not sharing. Not a tzaddik and not a rasha. Zu midah beinanis. V'yesh oimrim zu midah stoim. But there are those that say this is midah stoim. Midah stoim is shali shali v'shalach shalach. No sharing over here. And the Mefarshim are obviously bothered. How could we have such a thing where we have one Tana that says it's midah beinanis, nishkaferlach, not so bad, and the other Tana is saying that this is not midah beinanis, this is midah sedaim, this is why this sedaim got destroyed. How could you have one midah where you have one Tana saying it's okay, and the other Tana saying it's totally terrible? That's why sedaim got destroyed, this midah sedaim. So we've explained beautifully from the Bal HaKedah of Yitzchak Arma that he explains so beautifully and compellingly that the problem with Sidoim was not the Hashkafa of Shali, Shali, Shalach, Shalach. A person does an act of Shali, Shali, Shalach, Shalach. He's not willing to share. So that is something which is understandable. It's hard to part with money. It's hard to be a selfless person. It goes against the teva, the nature of person. We understand such a thing. The problem with Sidoim is that they turned it into their ideology. They turned it into their philosophy. That became the law of the land. Some even describe that they said it that it was letoivas hatzibur, that a person has to learn to be independent. And once you turn your weaknesses into a philosophy, into a hashkafa, into an ideology, so now you're no longer just being nichshal, you're no longer being weak, you no longer have a lapse in judgment, no longer are you succumbing to Yetzirah, but now this has become the ideal. This has become my philosophy. This has become my ideology. Midah Sidoim is Midah Beinun. It's not so difficult. But when that becomes your philosophy, when that becomes your ideology, then it's Sidoim. That's the lashon of Vayashkef. Vayashkifu Pnei Sidoim. Vayashkifu is used as a word to see, to gaze, but it means more. It means when it's turned into a Hashkafa, when everything is seen through this prism. When that's the Hashkafa, so then that's why Sidoim had to be destroyed. Little weaknesses here and there, pockets, lapses, okay, there are Rishon in every society. So there are Rishon, but there's hope. But once you turn it into the Hashkafa, Vayashkifu, once you see that that is our philosophy, that's our ideology, that has become the ideal, so that's why Sidoim had to be destroyed. A Jewish person brings his meiser to the Rabbeinu Shalom, and he says, I've done everything with my meiser that you asked me. I've given lager, liyosaim, v'la'almana. So the Rabbi, what he's telling the Rabbeinu Shalom is there could be lapses. I am not perfect. I am not without fault. But look at my Hashkafa. My Hashkafa is one, the opposite of Sidoim. The Hashkafa is not one of Shali, Shali, V'shalach, Shalach. My Hashkafa, Well, with eyes, the glasses through which I see everything is one of Meiser, where I give to the Ger, I give to the Yosam, I give to the Almana. So the Rebbeinu Shalom says, Vayashkifu al Pnei Sidoim. You know how you change that Vayashkifu into Hashkifa Mimoin Katshecha through Meiser, through Hilchas Meisers, through Matnas Aniyim. Through Matnas Aniyim you show that even though we may have lapses, look at our broader Hashkafa. Look at our Hashkifa. Look at our Vayashkifa Pnei Sidoim. Look at the eyes through which Klal Yisrael sees things. The exact opposite of Sidoim. Sidoim's problem wasn't so much in the actions, but more in their Hashkafa, their philosophy. Klal Yisrael changes the Hashkifa, the Hashkafa, from Midas Ra to Midas Toiva by changing the Hashkafa. We may have lapses, but look at our broader Hashkafa. It's one of Matnas Aniyim. It's one of Hilchas Meiser. Only Meisros, Matnas Aniyim, could change the word Hashkifa Mira'a L'Toiva, Chazal say. And this is what the bris of Har Grizim and Har Evel was. The unique nature of the bris of Har Grizim and Har Evel was that's where Klal Yisrael became Me'uravin Zebezeh, Kol Yisrael Harevim Zelazeh. And that's why it couldn't take place at Matan Torah, as the Maharal explains, because Arvus means that you're one unit. And when you're one unit, we are like, says the Maharal, a liquid. And a liquid needs a klei kibul to accept, to receive it. And what's our klei kibul? Eretz Yisrael. So we were able to be mekabel the bris of Har Sinai, but we weren't able to be mekabel the bris of Arvus till we get into Eretz Yisrael, till we come to Har Grizim and Har Evel. Comes Har Grizim and Har Evel, the Rebbeinu Shalom says, now I'm holding you even to a higher standard. Now I'm holding you to the standard of Kol Yisrael Harevim Zelazeh, where you become one unit. And you're held accountable for all those things which are interpersonal, which you may hold deeply, closely within yourself, which aren't so recognizable on the outside, but on the inside, you yourselves know your feelings towards your fellow Jew. The Rebbeinu Shalom comes and says, Parshas Ki Savo is a new bris. It's a bris of Arvus, a bris of Kol Yisrael, a Raven Zelazeh. It's a bris, as the Torah says, of V'halachta B'dracham, holding, being there for another Jew. And it's that bris which the Torah preempts by describing the mitzvah of Meiser and telling us that the Hashkafa of Klal Yisrael, the Vayashkifu of Klal Yisrael, is one of Meisros, of giving. We may have lapses here and there, but our basic Hashkafa, our philosophy, our ideology is one of Meisros. And with that Hashkafa, if we allow that not to just to be an act of giving, but we allow that to permeate our entire existence, our entire essence, Rebbeinu Shalom says, then you will be zoichet to the brachos in Parshas Ki Savo as opposed to the klalos. There's no greater introduction to the brachos of Parshas Ki Savo, to the brachos and klalos of Har Grizim and Har Evel, than the mitzvah of Matnas Aniyim, because it's that mitzvah which if it turns into Hashkafa, could change even Midas Hadin into Midas Rachamim.